Hi, everybody. This is Denise Tawwab. I am back for part two of the risk framing step. We're covering publication, NIST Special Publication 839 on managing information security risk at the organization, mission, business process, and information system layers. What we've covered so far is we did an overview. This is in the last presentation, and I'll link to that um, in the description. We did an overview of the risk management process. We talked about risk framing. We defined it. We talked about the inputs and the preconditions to the risk framing step. And then we got into the risk framing activities or task. There are 4 risk framing activities. We covered task 1.1 in the last presentation, and that's on your risk assumptions. Next, we're going to cover task 1.2 on risk constraints, task 1.3, where we'll talk about risk tolerance, task 1.4, where we'll discuss the priorities and trade-offs, and then we'll go over the outputs and post conditions of the risk framing step of the risk management process. So, task 1.2, risk constraints. And remember, guys, that I'm following closely Special Publication 839. And so you'll hear a lot of repetition because these are my study notes. And so I'm delivering this the way that I did when I was studying this material. I covered all the information just as is covered in the publication. And then I would listen to it while I was in the car. So this is how you're getting it here. If I came to your organization to do a presentation, some of the repetition would be stripped out. So task 1.2, risk constraints. All right. Task 1.2 says identify the constraints on the conduct of risk assessment, risk response, and risk monitoring activities within the organization. What's happening in your organization and outside of your organization that will constrain your risk assessment, risk response, and risk monitoring activities? The execution of the risk management process can be constrained in a number of ways, some of which are direct and obvious, and others are indirect. Financial limitations can constrain the set of risk management activities. Financial limitations can constrain the set of risk management activities directly by limiting the total resources that you have available for investment in risk assessments or in your safeguards or countermeasures. Or financial limitations can constrain the set of risk management activities indirectly by eliminating activities which, while involving relatively small investments in risk response, entail curtailing or discarding investments, for example, in legacy systems or information technology. So financially, you can be limited in what you can do. We all know that. Your organization might also discover that the need to continue to depend on legacy information systems might constrain the risk management options available to the organization. Many organizations, for instance, federal organizations, hospitals, a lot of companies, pharmaceutical companies have legacy information systems that work just fine. They worked for years, they work fine. Replacing them would cause a massive amount of disruption. And so they're still depending on those legacy systems. Having those systems might constrain how you, the phone is not ringing. Yes, it is. Constraints can also include, okay.
Call from source setting.
You know what?
Call from source setting.
I'm just going to cut this whole part of this presentation out. Okay, constraints can also include legal, regulatory, and/or contractual requirements. Such constraints can be reflected in your organizational policies. For example, restrictions on outsourcing, restrictions on information to be gathered as a part of risk monitoring. There are a lot of things that can happen in the legal and/or regulatory space and in your contracts that can constrain how you approach risk management. Another risk constraint is organizational culture. The culture of your organization, your business can impose indirect constraints on governance changes. For example, precluding a shift from decentralized to a hybrid governance structure. Um, and it can also constrain which security controls are considered by your organization as potential common controls. In particular, the organization's attitudes toward information technology risk that, for example, favor extensive automation and early adoption of new technologies can constrain the degree of risk avoidance and perhaps risk mitigation that can be achieved. Any cultural constraints that limit senior leaders' visibility into your information systems that are beyond their formal authority may impede the overall understanding of how complex the information system environment in your organization is and the related risk to the organization. So any kind of constraints, maybe a culture of silence, a culture of we don't share information outside of our department, any culture that limits what senior leaders can see information systems will also constrain how you approach risk management. Okay, at tier two, that's the mission business process level. Business owners interpret constraints in light of the mission business functions that they're in charge of. So you've tier one is the organization level, which is the high level view. But at tier two, you're down at the business level. So you're whoever's looking at risk constraints, they're looking in light of the mission business functions. Some regulatory constraints may not apply to particular business functions. For example, regulations that apply to international operations when your business is restricted to working in the United States. Alternatively, additional requirements may apply to you. For example, business processes that are performed jointly with another organization would impose contractual constraints. All right, at tier two, down at the system level, information system owners, common control providers, and or program managers interpret the organization-wide and mission business function specific constraints with respect to their systems and their environments of operation. For example, requirements to provide specific security controls are satisfied through common controls. Okay, so next up is task 1.3, risk tolerance. Risk tolerance. The risk tolerance task says identify the level of risk tolerance for the organization. Risk tolerance is the level of risk that your organization is willing to accept in pursuit of strategic goals and objectives. How much risk are we going to accept? Organizations define information security related risk tolerance organization wide, considering all of the missions and all of the business functions. Organizations can use a variety of risk and or reputation risk. Next up is task 1.4, which talks about your priorities and trade-offs. Risk is experienced at different levels, in different forms, and in different time frames. So at tier one, the organization layer, the organization will make trade-offs among and establish priorities for responding to such risk. Organizations tend to have a number of priorities that at times conflict with each other, which generates potential risk as well. So, approaches employed by organizations for managing portfolios of risk reflect the organization's culture, its risk tolerance, risk related assumptions and constraints, as we discussed in the earlier steps. These approaches are typically embodied in the strategic plans, policies, and roadmaps of organizations, which may indicate preferences for different kinds of risk response. For example, organizations may be willing to accept short term risk of slightly degraded operations to achieve long term reduction in information security risk. Let me say that again. Organizations may be willing to accept short term risk of slightly degraded operations to achieve long term reductions in information security risk. However, this trade off could be unacceptable for one particularly mission business function that's critical. For example, real time requirements in many industrial process control systems. So it depends. Can you accept slower performance, for example, for having more security? It depends on your organization and what kinds of systems you're running. For a high priority area, a different approach to improving security may be required, including the application of compensating security controls. And if you don't know what that is, take a look at my video on NIST 853, where we talk about that. Okay, so we've covered the task of the risk framing step of the risk management process. Task one, risk assumptions. What assumptions does your organization make about risk? Risk constraints. What's stopping you from doing everything that you might want to do? Your risk tolerance. Just how much risk is the organization willing to accept? And task one for the priorities and trade offs. And now we're going to talk about the outputs and post conditions. So, the key output of the risk framing step is your organization's risk management strategy. Outputs from the risk framing step serve as inputs to the risk assessment, risk response, and risk monitoring steps. Remember, the risk management process consists of 4 steps: frame, assess, respond, and monitor. The key output of the risk framing step is the risk management strategy, which identifies how your organization intends to assess, respond to, and monitor risk over time. The framing step also produces a set of organizational policies, procedures, standards, guidance, and resources. The scope of the organizational risk management process is one of the outputs: a risk assessment guidance, a risk response guide, risk monitoring guides which cover monitoring frequency, the methods that you're going to use, and your reporting structure. Other risk constraints on executing risk management activities, and organizational priorities and trade offs. So let's say this again. The risk framing outputs from a policy, procedure, standards, guidance, and resource standpoint include the scope of the organizational risk management process, the risk assessment guidance, the risk response guidance, the risk monitoring guidance, other risk constraints on executing risk management activities, and your organizational priorities and trade offs. And this is a set of documentation that is disseminated throughout the organization to people who are involved in risk management activities so that there is a consistent and organizational wide understanding of the organization's approach to risk management. The scope of the organizational risk management process includes the organizational entities that are covered, the mission business functions that are affected, and how risk management activities are applied within the risk management tiers. So, the risk assessment guidance, let's talk about that. The risk assessment guidance includes, for example, the characterization of threat sources. What's threatening your organization? The sources of your threat information. Where are you getting the sources of your threat information? Are you just listening to what's happening on the news? Are you industry group? Where are your threat source information coming from? Next, representative threat events, the different tactics, techniques, and procedures that your organization might face coming against your business, when to consider and how to evaluate threats. Your risk assessment and guidance will include the sources of your vulnerability information. What's happening inside your organization or inside your industry that makes you particularly vulnerable to a specific threat? And where do you get that information from? And then your guidance will include your risk assessment methods that are going to be used within the organization. Is it centralized, decentralized? Are you doing quantitative or qualitative? Um, that will depend on your organization, and that will be discussed and agreed upon in the risk framing step. And then finally, your risk assumptions. Now, for your risk response guidance, which tells how you're going to handle the different threats, that guidance will include, for example, your risk tolerances, the risk response concepts to be used, opportunity cost, trade offs, consequences of different responses, a hierarchy of authorities, who's in charge of what and how does stuff get escalated, and your priorities. For your risk monitoring guidance, another output from the risk framing step, the risk monitoring guidance is going to include, for example, guidance on the analysis of monitored risk factors to determine changes in risk, your monitoring frequency. How often are we going to be looking at different parts of our system? Your monitoring methods. Is it going to be automated? Is it going to be manual? I don't know, but you have to agree on that. And that depends on your organization's resources and your culture. And your reporting. How often are we going to report out, and to whom are we reporting about the security posture of our different systems? Other risk framing outputs would be additional risk constraints on executing risk management activities and your organizational priorities and trade offs. And it's a lot. It seems like a lot because it's just one step in the risk management process. But this is your preparation step. And this is what the risk management framework, which is covered in this special publication 837, what the risk management framework calls the prepare step. And this is revision 2 of the risk of 837. But there's a step in there called the prepare step. And this is the work that an organization has to do before it even starts to begin to secure the information systems and the data. I mean, a lot of times we just want to go in and we want firewalls and we want malware protection and we want endpoint protections and we want to do some patching. But in order to be effective at information security, you have to understand your organization's environment. You have to know the systems. You have to know what information you're protecting. You have to understand the organization's culture, your constraints, your assumptions, the risk tolerance. You have to understand all of that, and you have to understand it holistically so that you can put together a process that actually serves the greater needs of the organization. So that's my take on it. What we covered, an overview of the process. What is risk framing? We talked about inputs, preconditions, risk framing activities, assumptions, constraints, tolerance, priorities, trade-offs, outputs, and post conditions. And that is step 1 of the risk management process, risk framing. Thank you guys so much for joining me, and I'll see you on the next presentation. Next up, we're going to talk about step 2, risk assessment. Thanks, and have a great day.